Good morning. I'm Jean Teljohn. I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Alumni Council, and it's my great honor to introduce Denis Feeney this morning. Born in New Zealand, Denis Feeney did his first degrees at Auckland University before receiving his PhD from Oxford. Since then, he has taught at Cambridge, Oxford, and the University of Wisconsin at Madison before coming to Princeton in the year 2000 as the Geiger Professor of Latin. Professor Feeney has written 3 books, The Gods in Epic and Literature and Religion at Rome, both on the problem of how to interpret ancient literature's engagement with religion, and Caesar's Calendar on how the Romans conceived of time. He has been named both a Guggenheim Fellow and an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow. Having lectured to great acclaim this fall on wormholes and time machines on the site of Virgil's Rome, as part of President Tillman's lecture series, we are very pleased to have Professor Feeney with us on Alumni Day to talk about Greek tragedy and us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Denis Feeney.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming. When I saw that I was up against stem cells, I was quite worried. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes. Is that great? Thank you. Well, welcome to Princeton. Welcome back to Princeton. You remember that at Princeton there's always a precept to go with the lecture. So we'll have a precept after the lecture before you get away at 10:15. But there'll be no quiz. It's okay. Just do the lecture. So, Greek tragedy and us. Well, what does Greek tragedy mean to us anyway? People often describe great works of art such as Greek tragedy as timeless. But nothing human is timeless. Greek tragedy is very time-bound. It's a unique art form, very specifically produced at a certain time and place. So what I want to do to begin with today is to try to evoke some of the strangeness of Greek tragedy, some of the elements of Greek tragedy that are odd, that are alien. Because when you see a production of tragedy now, almost invariably people try to make it natural. They make it want to look like Ibsen or Chekhov or George Bernard Shaw or even Shakespeare. But I want to try and evoke some of the ways in which it's very alien, in which it's a very peculiar kind of art form. But having done that, obviously, we're still left with the fact that people keep reading Greek tragedy, people keep staging Greek tragedy. There's something in this alien art form that still speaks to us, that still hits our modern concerns, that still resonates with us and makes us want to engage with it. So we need to try and take account of that as well. So let's begin by getting an idea of what kind of strange art form it is that we're dealing with. For the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to have to invite you to get in a time machine to imagine that you're not in Princeton, you're in Greece. If it behaves, you'll be in Greece. Oops, sorry. That's Athens, the well-known Athens, but I do want to go back. There we are. This is where we are, Athens, where many of you will have been, I'm sure. This is the well-known Acropolis with the well-known Parthenon on top of it. It's middle of March, let's say 450 BC. Middle of March in Athens is much more pleasant than middle of March in Princeton. The sailing season has begun again after the winter, and the Athenians put on their great international festival, the Dionysia, the festival in honor of the god Dionysus. And he is the god of ecstasy and the god of tragedy. Here's his theater. So we're going to zoom in on that. Forget this. I know I'm a professor of Latin, but that's only Roman. So for today, we're going to ignore that, and we're going to look at this. And you can see the way that the theater of Dionysus, basically is just part of the hill. It takes advantage of the natural contours of the hill. It's an obvious place where you can get a whole lot of people to sit down. And here it is. The very first productions of Greek tragedy, let's say 500 BC, 510 BC, people would have just been sitting on the grass. And this gets built up, and so the remains that you're looking at now are in fact a couple of hundred years after the great productions of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. But anyway, it gives us some kind of idea. And at this point, we have to try and perform the mental exercise of trying to imagine how different it was from what we experience when we go to the theater. When we go to the theater, we go into an enclosed space. It's almost invariably at night. The lights go down. We turn off our cell phones. We turn around and glower and hush at people who make a noise. If you're late, you have to wait until halftime. And there are about 300 of you at Macassar, or maybe there might be 1,000 people or something like that in a very big theater in New York. But for them, it's a very different experience. There are perhaps 15,000 people sitting on the side of this hill. This is a mock-up of what it would have looked like in about 200 BC. And when Aeschylus is putting on his first dramas around 480 BC, it's much more primitive. But this gives you an idea. We've got all these seats here, something like 15,000 people, many of them sitting on the grass in the early days. But then it gets more and more built up. We have here some kind of stage, maybe not raised very much, maybe not raised at all in the early days, but that's the space for the actors up here. And this is the orchestra, the word that we get orchestra from. That's from the Greek word to dance. That's where the chorus sing and dance. So that's their space. Originally 12 of them, then 15, and that's where they sing and dance. So that we have the actors' space, the chorus space, and on the sides there's a little what we would call an orchestra. I mean musicians, because someone has to accompany the singing and the dancing. So it's much more like a public festival. It's open, it's in the daytime, there's no artificial lighting. You watch all day. You start at about 11 o'clock and you go right through watching 3 tragedies, then a satyr play, and then a comedy. This is a public occasion. All the big guys are there. The big seats in front, labeled here. Hiereos he paistu. This belongs to the priest of Hephaestus. That's where the priest of Hephaestus sits. And the various other priests, and especially, of course, the priest of Dionysus, because he is the chief priest of the god in whose honor this festival is being held. And they would actually, for the first day of the festivals, go to the temple of Dionysus and get his statue out and bring it to the temple and put it in the front row so he could get a good view and enjoy all of the plays. Now, Dionysus is not the patron god of theater for nothing. He is the god, according to the Greeks, who liberates you, who takes you out of yourself, who makes you take on a new identity, who makes you cross over a boundary into some other kind of way of thinking about yourself. This is what he does even before theater. And since this is really what theater does anyway, he's the ideal god to embody that. So I want to just spend a little bit of time looking at the cult of Dionysus to see in what ways it shares these elements with theater. He's my favorite Greek god. I get my name from him. Denis, not Feeney. That's right. So here he is. And here are these women. There's this constant fantasy in Greek life that women in the service of Dionysus escape their normal boundaries, break their normal roles, leave the city, go out into the country in a state of ecstasy. Now, this is not really what happened. I mean, normal female cults for Dionysus was like the women's branch of the Rotary Club. But this was part of their imagination. And pretty wild things were supposed to go on. This is the sparagmos, where you get hold of an animal and rip it up. Snake handling, which is still a part of religious cult in some parts of this country. And you can see these women here have been, well, they could be in religious ecstasy, but they look as if they've been drinking. Here's one of Dionysus's satyrs holding this thyrsos, which is a piece of vegetation that grows, and they wave it around in their ecstasy. So the cult of Dionysus is fascinated with taking on a new identity, with transgressing the normal boundaries, with becoming somebody else, with imagining yourself being somebody else. And this is what we can see in these representations. Men honoring Dionysus will also dress as women. Now, this guy is obviously a man. This is a young man as well. He's carrying the same thyrsos that we saw the satyr holding. And this is a sign of his allegiance to the cult of Dionysus. And the older man, the younger man, They're dressing up as women. They're imagining, what would it be like to be a woman? And this reminds us that all of the actors in Greek tragedy were men. There were no women actors. All of the roles were played by young adolescent men, or perhaps even older men if they were playing an older woman. This is exactly the situation that we're used to from Shakespeare, of course. In early modern England, all of the women's roles were played by adolescent boys. There's a gorgeous moment that you may remember at the end of Shakespeare's Anti-Cleopatra, where he plays on this, where Cleopatra says she's going to commit suicide rather than go to Rome and be led in the triumph. She said, if I go to Rome and led in the triumph, they'll put on all these plays about me, and I'll have to watch. And she says, Antony shall be brought drunken forth, and some squeaking Cleopatra shall buoy my greatness in the posture of a whore. And here's the boy acting Cleopatra, saying, I'm not going to watch a boy play me. It's a very, very strange moment. Here's Dionysus himself, dressed as a woman too. These see-through clothes are the woman's clothes, and he too is ripping up the animal. So even Dionysus will become a woman, or imagine what it's like to be a woman, take on the role of a woman. He's the god of wine, of course. Wine is the normal situation in which the Greek becomes somebody else, or has the normal boundaries between regular behavior and his own ecstatic behavior broken down. You can become a beast. These are the satyrs here, playing the musical instrument that they would have been playing on the dramatic stage, plucking grapes, putting the grapes in and trampling them, but they're already under the influence, even before they've made their vintage. And these satyrs are a sort of emblem of the kind of thing you could be transformed into if you don't control your wine properly. The Greeks never drank wine neat. They always put water in it. Otherwise, they call it drinking like a barbarian. So Dionysus can take you out of yourself, expose you to other forces, expose you to forces that you normally don't encounter. And this is the kind of experiment that the Greeks love performing. The Greeks have this very sophisticated ethnographic imagination. You see it in Herodotus as well as in drama, this ability to try and imagine what it's like to be the other person. What is it like to be a Trojan? What is it like to be a Persian? In drama, this is happening all the time too. What is it like to be a satyr? What is it like to be a cyclops? What's it like to be a woman? And drama enables the Greek imagination to take on these role plays and to imagine, to step into somebody else's shoes. In Greek, this disorientating encounter with something else is often represented in art by the full face. It's interesting, I didn't really notice this until quite recently, but in Greek vases and pots, people are always in profile, like this. But in moments of weakness or loss of self-control, the full face comes into play. So if you're asleep, here's some poor monster who's sound asleep, and here's Heracles who's going to kill him. You can tell it's Heracles. He's got his lion skin on. Pallas Athena is helping him. You can tell the monster is asleep because he's got his eyes closed, and also because the god Sleep is sitting on top of him. And that's when you see he's out of control and his face falls towards you, swerves towards you. When you're dying, when you're drunk, here's the drinking bowl, about this big. It's full of wine, and by the time you've emptied it, there's this drunken face staring at you at the bottom. It's really... So these are dangerous and dislocating moments. These are moments when you can see a potential you there, some other you that you don't normally like to think about. Someone staring back at you, asking you to identify them. This is what you look like when you're asleep. This is what you're going to look like when you're dead. This is what you look like when you're drunk, dummy. This is what everyone around you is seeing at the drinking party. The full face is very scary. This is Medusa with her snaky hair. It's a frightening thing to the Greeks, to be fully forced to confront someone else's face. This is Dionysus with this extraordinarily enigmatic expression, these huge eyes, this unreadable face, inviting you to identify with him and making it very hard, very, very disorientating. The mask of the actor is another full-face encounter. Here, the actors themselves are in profile. Everyone here is in profile. But the mask The actors are in costume, and the last thing they do is going to put on the mask. And the mask is turned towards us. Not fully, actually, in this picture. This vase is very interesting. Here is the actor sitting. And you see all the humans, the people have got profile, but this mask is turned towards us to look at, but the actor is looking directly at his mask, which is profile to us, but it's not to him. And we're invited to imagine what it's like for him staring at the mask that he's going to put on. So what you see on the stage are a series of masks staring straight at you in this rather frightening and disorientating way, inviting you to identify. All of the actors wear masks. All of the chorus wear masks. And the masks are really spooky things. They're a visible sign of the fact that someone is impersonating somebody else, that they're becoming somebody else. It's not really them. And of course, our word impersonate comes from the Latin word for a mask, the persona. So if you impersonate, you put on a mask. Pretend to be someone else. For the first audiences in the very early days, around 510 BC, no one had ever done drama before. Suddenly, they invent this genre. It's very, very extraordinary. I think for them it must have been very disorientating. I think for them it must have felt as if their statues had come to life. The Greek city was full of statues. But of course, our idea of what a Greek statue looks like is totally different from what they actually look like. This guy, for example, would have looked like this. And this is the pediment of the temple of Pallas Athena at Aegina, the island just across from Athens. You see her staying here. This has all been washed away by millennia of erosion and so on, but you can reconstruct from the paint traces how gorgeously vivid these images were. So a statue of a young woman, a chore in Athens, looks like this. She would have looked something like that. So for the audience in 500 BC, seeing these very stately, imposing creatures moving with their masks and with these gorgeous colors, as I say, I think to them, originally it would have really felt disorientating. It would have felt as if the god, some statue of a god, was actually moving around in a very, very freaky way. This is a footnote, but all Greek art has to be reinterpreted like this. This is a little funeral vessel for pouring oil on someone's grave. Originally would have looked something like that. So the formal conventions of Greek drama are something that take a little bit of getting used to. And the mask in particular is something that very few modern productions engage with. It can be done. In 1982, I was privileged to see the extraordinary production of Peter Hall's Oresteia, his production of Aeschylus's Oresteia in London, where everyone wore masks. Apparently the actors found this extraordinarily difficult. It took them months to get used to wearing a mask. I'll be talking about the Oresteia a little bit, so brief précis. It's in 3 plays. Each tragedian put on 3 plays, but this is the only trilogy that survives. This is the only group of 3 that survives. The first one, Agamemnon, he comes back from sacking Troy, and he's met by his wife Clytemnestra, who's been having an affair all these years with Aegisthus. She's very angry at Agamemnon because he killed their daughter, Iphigenia, to please the gods so that he could go to Troy. Anyway, he comes back, she meets him, she kills him in the bath. In the second play, Orestes, the son who's been sent away, he comes back and he plots with his sister Electra to kill the mother because the god Apollo has told him he has to kill Clytemnestra, the mother, in revenge for the father's death. And then in the third play, the Furies, and these are the Furies come and hound him and drive him and are trying to tip him over the cliff of madness. And he goes to Athens. And there's an extraordinary scene of reconciliation, and the Furies come around. Here he is with the Furies. These are the Furies, and there's Orestes in the middle, like a little fish caught in the middle of a nest of sea anemones. And the Furies, with these extraordinary masks, were an amazing thing to see. It was a very, very interesting and strange production. There was a lot of music. There was a lot of dancing. The translation was the only bad thing. Tony Harrison did the translation. He's a brilliant poet. But he wanted the elemental element of Aeschylus. He wanted it all to be basic and gripping and so on. And he made it sound sort of like Beowulf. Whereas, in fact, Aeschylus is more like T.S. Eliot than Beowulf. But anyway, apart from that, it was a really very extraordinary thing. And the mask, I was astonished. A lecturer at the beginning of the second play, for example, comes out to give honor to her father's tomb. And her mask, the grief was indescribable. I mean, the picture of grief that she conveyed. Then Orestes comes along, the mother is killed, and she's jubilant. It's still the same mask. It's very strange how the mask was so plastic. So the mask is the most obvious sign of the way in which Athenian drama was much more formal than our drama. In many ways, in fact, Athenian drama is much more like an opera, like a high opera, bel canto, than it is like a normal drama for us. It was all in verse, for a start. Even Shakespeare has bits of prose, but ancient drama has no prose at all. It's all in verse. Most of it is spoken verse, the iambic trimeter, which is very like Shakespeare's iambic meter. A lot of it is in recitative, as in a modern opera, where there's musical accompaniment, and people aren't exactly singing, but they're recitative. And then there's quite a bit of aria, full-blown aria, where people are singing these grand operatic productions. Now, these formal elements make a very big difference, and it's something that we should always try to be aware of when we're studying tragedy. One of the obvious big differences is that in Attic drama, high-status characters don't sing. Gods never sing. Adult male citizens practically never sing. Women sing, and barbarians sing, and young men, very young men, sing. But men, real men, don't sing. So this means that when they do sing, it's something extraordinary. In Euripides' great play, Hippolytus, that was the model for Racine's Phèdre, Theseus comes back from the underworld to discover that his wife has just committed suicide, hours before. And he's absolutely devastated by this. And he's trying to react to this and trying to cope with it. And there's an extraordinary moment for about 40 or 50 lines where he moves between song and speech, between singing and verse, spoken verse. And he's trying to assert self-control. He's trying to dominate his feelings. And then they keep breaking out. So if you went to a modern production of Euripides' Hippolytus in English, you'd hear him saying something like this: "To the gloom under earth, I would change my dwelling and die in darkness, luckless man that I am. Bereft of your sweet company, you have destroyed me more completely than you destroyed yourself." So in the original Greek, this is 4 lines, but the first 2 lines are sung. And then he tries to come back to his speech. So in the original Greek, it would have sounded something like, "Tokata gas te lo, tokata gas knepas metoi kain skototanon, o talamon, tes ses, derethes, piltates homilias, apolazascar, malon e katephthizo." And then he sings again, and then he speaks again. This goes on for 40 lines. So, and when he's singing, he's accompanied by music. And then he speaks, and the music stops. And then he sings, and the music begins in this way. So this is something that I don't know if you could do in a modern production, but it's the kind of very formal, operatic kind of moment which we're relying upon the audience's knowledge of the formal conventions. So this formalism creates an imaginative distance, which is actually a very good space for art. Most modern productions of Greek drama avoid the masks and avoid the singing and so on. And there are good and bad reasons for this. One of the main reasons they do that is because modern people think that realism is real and that naturalism is natural. And it always takes quite a bit of an effort to remind ourselves that there's no inherently real or natural way of representing human action. It's all a convention. Whatever we do is a convention. This was all laid out 50 years ago very brilliantly by the great E.H. Gombrich in his wonderful book, Art and Illusion, which contains a representation of my favorite cartoon. This is the Egyptian life class, which sort of... So when you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you see all these Egyptians like this. But he's puncturing the idea that artists paint what they see. I mean, they don't paint what they see. They have ways of doing things. And so what this wonderful cartoon represents, or what Gombrich proves to us in this great book of his, is that realism is an effect. It's a congruence of certain codes. Naturalism is only one way of doing things. It's just a generic convention. In the movies, of course, we're much more used to intuiting this. Schindler's List is a wonderful example. I'm sure most people here have seen it, because it's shot in black and white. You think, well, why is Schindler's List shot in black and white? Because it's more realistic. Well, why is it more realistic? I mean, the Second World War didn't happen in black and white. But it feels more realistic because it's more congruent with our received images of World War II, which, of course, are in black and white. It's very strange. It's like the German accent in Schindler's List, you know. Ach so few screws. And you, well, I mean, Germans don't speak German with a German accent. I mean, they speak German. But it's a way of making it feel more real. It's a sleight of hand. Something very similar, of course, with photography in general. I mean, if color photography had been invented first in 1850, then we would have just had color. But it took 80 years to get color. So all the first photographs are in black and white. So any photographs now that have pretensions to the status of art or to the status of documentary reality, still black and white. The beginning of Saving Private Ryan, that extraordinary opening moment, is very evocative of this, because Spielberg shoots it in this very desaturated color. It's not black and white, but it feels somehow like black and white. And the reason that he's doing that, of course, is that he wants to evoke the images that Robert Capa took on D-Day on Omaha Beach. So Spielberg wants to make the experience of warfare feel more real. How does he do that? He makes it look more like a black and white photograph. Very peculiar. But this shows how deeply embedded our assumptions about realism and naturalism are. Every genre has its own levels of naturalism, and we're very used to negotiating them in our own culture. We can watch The Sopranos, gritty realism. Then we go to a Broadway musical, where people are dancing on the top of taxicabs. Now, if Tony Soprano danced on the top of the taxicab, you'd think he'd lost his mind. But we move from one genre to another without any trouble. Then we go to high opera, which has another set of criteria altogether. And we do this without really thinking about it. We negotiate these generic conventions very naturally and insensibly. So people often think that high formalism cannot have profound emotional power. But, I mean, obviously it can. I mean, anyone who's been to the opera knows that a highly artificial and unrealistic mode can have profound emotional power. There's nothing more unrealistic than opera. A whole lot of very overweight people who are meant to be very good-looking singing nonsense, I mean, complete nonsense. And yet it has a visceral effect on an audience if it's properly done. The moment that really brought this home to me, the idea that highly stylized and conventionalized forms of representing human action can have gut-wrenching, direct emotional power, was when I went with my wife to see a production of Euripides' Medea at the Edinburgh Arts Festival in 1986. This was by a Japanese company, directed by Yukio Ninagawa, who used kabuki dance technique. It was in Japanese. My wife took some persuading to go. It was outdoors. It's Edinburgh, so the first 20 minutes it was pouring with rain. But it was the most moving and overpowering theatrical experience I've ever had. The chorus there you see behind Medea, all men, of course, though it's a chorus of women, they sang and danced together in this extraordinarily eerie way. Medea herself, this is Medea in front, of course, played by a man. The story of Medea, she's a barbarian who runs away with Jason, leaves her family. She goes back to Greece, to Corinth, but then after they have a couple of sons, after a few years, Jason decides he needs to go up the corporate ladder, get a trophy wife. He ditches Medea, marries the king's daughter. Medea kills the children. And the moment at the end of the play, when she goes in to kill the children, there's a block on the stage with a sword in it. And this actor took off all this stuff. And there was this skinny man in a black leotard who then picked up the sword and went inside with the sword up like this. And Handel's Saraband was blaring out in the background. Bum, 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 bum. It was unbelievable. My wife was sitting beside me, and she was staring at it like this. And then, at the end, Medea gets away with it. and she's on a crane, high, high up, transmogrified into a goddess. And there she is at the top. And I had to bump my wife, look up there, because she was so... Now, it was in Japanese. It was not the power of Euripides' language that was winning us over. It was this extraordinary enactment of confrontation and formalism that did it. So Athenian drama is very formal and very aware of its formalism, too. One of the most obvious ways in which it's aware of its formalism is the way that they play with the three-actor rule. One of the strangest things about Athenian drama is that you're only allowed 3 actors with speaking roles. Originally, there would have been 1 talking to the chorus. Aeschylus apparently, supposedly, added a 2nd, and then Sophocles added a 3rd, and they never added any more. So you're only allowed 3 people who can speak. You can have more people on the stage who can't speak if you want, but you can only have 3 people speaking. In Aeschylus' second play of the trilogy I mentioned, there's an amazing moment that plays with this. When Orestes, he's got this pal Pylades, who always tracks along with him. It's a sort of buddy pair. So Orestes and Pylades have come back. They're going to kill the mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Complicated things go on. They go inside, Orestes and Pylades. They kill Aegisthus. A slave comes running out, saying, Aegisthus has been killed, what's to happen? Clytemnestra comes running out, talks to the slave, go and get me an axe. Orestes and Pylades come out, and Orestes and Clytemnestra start speaking. So we've got the slave, we've got Clytemnestra, and we've got Orestes. Those are our 3 actors. And we know that no one else is allowed to speak. So at a certain point, Clytemnestra turns to Orestes and she says, now how this is done on the stage, heaven knows. She points at her breast and she says, have pity on this breast that suckled you. Don't kill me. And Orestes turns to Pylades and he says, Poulade tidrazo. Pylades, what shall I do? Which is the quintessential Greek drama question. No one in Greek drama stands around, how do I feel about this? What do I think? So what shall I do? Meter aidesto ktenein. Shall I feel shame at killing my mother? And Pylades speaks. Pylades says, do what Apollo says. It's as if Apollo has taken possession of him. And Apollo is ventriloquizing through Pylades. It's, in any modern production, a stunning moment anyway. But in the ancient thing, it would never cross anyone's minds that this guy might actually say something. It must have been an extraordinary moment. And he takes her inside and does kill her, because another one of the rules of Athenian drama is no violence on stage. So he takes her inside to kill her. And then the Furies come. So as Aristotle says, actually, there's a nice riff on this by Euripides. Just a nice way of showing how different Euripides is from the others. Not better, not worse, just different, as they say in the elementary schools. So he has a play called Orestes, which is another version. So Orestes in this play, still with Pylades. Pylades is always with Orestes. They've run to Argos. It's a melodrama, extraordinarily complicated plot. At the end of the play, Orestes was supposed to marry the daughter of Menelaus and Helen, Hermione. Anyway, things have gone very badly wrong. Orestes and Pylades have got Hermione, and they've taken her up on the roof, and they're going to kill her. Orestes, because this is what Orestes does, he kills women. So he's standing there with his sword at her neck, and Menelaus, the father of Hermione, comes running in, and he begs with Orestes, don't do this. And so we've got Menelaus, we've got Orestes, and we've got Hermione. So we know that no one else can speak, but we've also know the Aeschylus play, so we've got a hunch that Pylades might say something unexpectedly. So at a certain point, Menelaus is sick of talking to Orestes. He's just a brat. And he turns to Pylades. Pylades, what do you think? And Orestes says, that's all right, I'll do the talking for Pylades. So it's as if, that he might have said something, but he's not going to. So this very self-conscious awareness of how the genre works is very, very striking all the way through. Now, the greatest work of literary criticism ever written is Aristotle's Poetics. And in the Poetics, Aristotle says, tragedy is the imitation of an action. It's not about character, it's about action. And the characters are encountering each other through their attitudes to an action, whatever the action is. And this is what gives Athenian drama its incredible power. There's a stark simplicity of structure that focuses on an action and a choice over an action, combined with a really intense development of the emotional concerns involved in making that choice. So Greek tragedies again and again and again show people making a choice, having to come to a decision. So these masked individuals, they confront each other, they meet each other over this crisis, whatever it is. Crisis in Greek, means choice, judgment. And they do so in front of an interested public who's represented by the chorus. So the chorus are part of a network of relationships involving the actors, their fellow citizens, or their sailors in the company or something of that kind, always involved. So whenever I'm reading a Greek tragedy or seeing one, I sort of imagine these people like statues around a problem, and the pain that they suffer, and they all suffer pain, that's a tragedy, is almost like something physical that they're handing around from one person to another, making each person confront what's happening. In Athenian drama, these decisions are almost invariably taking place within a family. Almost invariably. And this is another one of the sources of emotional power in Athenian drama. The number of myths that the Athenian dramatists use and keep going back to again and again is quite small. And they keep going back to the same families. They keep going back to 3 or 4 catastrophically dysfunctional families. The great Bernard Knox, who died just a few months ago, a great classic scholar who was a friend of our own Bob Fagel's and wrote the introductions to Bob Fagel's great translations of Homer and of Virgil. I was once at a lecture that he gave where he was describing an experience he had at the Greek theatre in Epidavros, which is roughly here. And it was Sophocles' Electra. All of the tragedians loved this story about Orestes having to kill his mother, so they all did a version which survives. It's the only treatment of the same story by each one of the dramatists that we have. So in Sophocles' Electra, Sophocles has Electra, the sister, outside, while Orestes and Pylades are inside killing Clytemnestra. And Clytemnestra screams out from inside. She's inside. She screams out, "Oi moi perplegmai, oh, I've been hit." And Bernard Knox said, sitting beside him, there was this Greek businessman in a 3-piece blue suit who was just sitting there watching the play. So Clytemnestra calls out, "Oi moi perplegmai." Electra then says, "Paison eis thenes diplain." Hit her again if you've got the strength. And this Greek businessman jumped up and started clapping like this. So you just imagine the demons that are being released in this poor man. So the family is key to our response to these plays. The relationship between the husband and wife, between the father and the daughter, the father and the son, the mother and the daughter, the mother and the son, brothers and sisters, all of these relationships get replayed and replayed as the audience learn and relearn what their role is in the family, what their relationship is with the people that they spend all their time with. And there's no doubt that the stage has a way of talking about these issues, and especially a way of talking about the role of women in the society that is infinitely more mature and sophisticated than anything else that an Athenian citizen would have heard in any other aspect of his life. And this makes it all the more interesting that we still don't know whether women were in the audience or not. Froma Zeitlin, my revered former colleague, who knows 10 times as much about Athenian drama as I do, she thinks they were. So I suppose I should bow to authority, but I like the idea of all these men getting together and acting out their deepest fantasies and horrors without any women, and then, I don't know, anyway. But it's curious. This is a well-documented society. It's an era that we know a lot about, and we're just not sure. You find good authority on both sides. Anyway, so the family is crucial. It's also, of course, very, very striking how these plays seem to anticipate so many of our modern concerns with questions of politics and questions of justice as well. Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia trilogy, it's about many, many things. But one of the things it's about, one of the main things it's about, is the way that the family has to subordinate its lust for revenge to a social structure. In the last of the three plays shows Orestes going to Athens and a law court for murder being established, where the Athenian citizens are able to provide a venue where the family can give up. The family can say, all right, the cycle is going to stop. The revenge cycle cannot go on and on and on. So the society is able to provide a framework where the individuals can pull their grievances, reconcile with each other, and decide that life has to go on. So these are concerns that matter to us as well, of course. These plays were composed during a very long century of almost continuous warfare, and there are many plays about the impact of warfare on society, what it's like to be bereaved. There are many plays about the plight of the refugee, about groups of people who have to run away and seek asylum. Are we going to receive them or not? These are deep issues in Greek tragedy. In 415 BC, the Athenians totally devastated the island of Milos here. They killed all the men and they sold all the women and children into slavery. The next year, Euripides put on a play called The Trojan Women, which imagines the day after the sack of Troy. All the men have been killed and the women and the children are there, and they're being divided up into groups. You're going to go with Agamemnon, you're going to go with Menelaus, you're going to go with Odysseus. And the last surviving heir of the royal line, the son of Hector and Andromache, is taken away to be thrown off the Tower of Troy and killed. So Euripides uses this mythical setting in order to remind his audience that the kind of action that they took the year before has consequences. Because the fall of Troy is the moment at which everything tips and goes wrong for the Greeks. Their great moment of victory, in a classic example of arrogance and military folly and imperial overreach, they blow it. They overreact, and they all suffer the consequences. So for us now, the Athenian century is a sort of mythical period, the way the Trojan War was for the Athenians. And we still keep jumping back over time the way that they did. You show undergraduates these plays, and they draw the comparisons and the connections themselves with their own lives and with the world that they're living in now. So in teaching tragedy, it's always, for me, really amazing to see students making these connections between now and then, in exactly the way that Athenian citizens were making connections between their time and the mythical past of the great families and disasters that they are watching. So these great texts are very patient of interpretation. Every generation brings their own concerns and their own anxieties to the plays and can learn from them and can interact with them in their own specific way. So even though I've been stressing that the dramas are the product of a very specific time and place and are a very alien kind of art form in all sorts of important ways, they still speak to us. They still reach out to us over 2.5 millennia. That's why they call them the classics. Thank you. There you go. Thank you very much. Thanks. So now we can have some precept discussion. Yes. So.
3 quick things. You said there's usually the day's activities would include 3 tragedies, a satyr play, and a comedy. Were the 3 tragedies usually a trilogy like the Oresteia?
That's a good question. The 3 tragedies were always, they had 3 days in a row. So 3 tragedians were selected to present. So one would be day 1, then day 2, day 3.
Okay.
So the 3 plays in question would always be by the same dramatist. But in fact, not many of them were trilogies in a connected sense. Yeah.
We saw the trilogy in one
So when you
session.
go to Penguin Classics and get Sophocles' Theban trilogy, which has got the Oedipus Tyrannus, the Oedipus at Colonus, and the Antigone, you get the feeling that it's a trilogy, but he didn't. He wrote them at 20-year intervals.
And you indicated that
thank you.
these lines were sung, these lines weren't. Are there notes in the plays that indicate that, or how do you know what was sung or what wasn't?
The meter tells you.
Okay. And how did 15,000 people hear without amplification?
Well, the masks must have helped. But have people here been to Epidavros? Yeah. And if you go to Epidavros, there's almost invariably a tour there, and the tour guide is almost invariably dropping a coin in the middle of the orchestra, and you can hear it. In fact, the first time I went to Epidavros, there was a German tour guide who wasn't just dropping a coin. She was reciting from the chorus of Aeschylus' Agamemnon. Dekaton menetos todete priamu, etc. And this, I was sitting in the back, I could hear it like that. So people often speculate that the masks also helped project the sound. That's more controversial. But a good, well-trained actor speaking front, again, it's not naturalistic. They're not going like this all the time the way people are on a modern stage. They're standing and speaking. Yes, sir.
My question is about the bear of the consequences of those actions. Mm-hmm. And very often, the bear of those consequences are the next generation or even the next generation who have nothing to do with the deeds, the action themselves.
Yeah.
Now, this brings a very unsettling feeling within the reader. Why he should be punished, and yet at the same time, you feel there is an order, a cosmic order, which goes beyond what we call the, say, legal justice.
Yeah.
How did one reconcile these two conflicts within the tragedy itself? I mean, even today we face this.
Yeah.
For instance, like I think the recent death of Mark Meadow as versus his father's. I don't know how to do this. I feel that it's so just tearing the reader, or in this case, apart, I mean, ourselves.
Well, that's the kind of question that people write books about. I mean, it is a very, very difficult question, and a very good question, because it takes us right to the heart of one of the things that makes this drama so powerful. Because there are so many things that feel radically unjust, radically wrong. Why should the son pay for the sins of the father? The fact is, sons often do pay for the sins of the father. Whether drama can account for this or justify it is another question. But one of the things I find working with these plays with undergraduates is, you know, what a lucky life our 19-year-olds live. I mean, their assumptions about the inherent fairness and justice of the world are extraordinary. But if you're an Athenian citizen and you're 30 years old and sitting in one of these productions, you've probably already lost a wife. You've probably already lost a son or two, or a brother fighting in a war. You know, I mean, these people have lived far more tumultuous and extraordinary lives than we can imagine. And therefore, to them, things which to us seem unaccountably unfair and radically wrong are part of the rhythm of the way things work. Their religion is, of course, very different from Judeo-Christian assumptions. Their religion assumes that the world is the way it is and we're part of it. The world wasn't made for us, it wasn't made for our benefit, it wasn't made with us in mind. We just happen to be in the world, the way oak trees and wolves happen to be in the world. And there are these natural forces in the world, but they don't owe us anything.
I'm curious about the dismemberment of the animals in the Dionysian cult. It doesn't look sacrificial. What's going on there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because it pinpoints the fact that a lot of what happens in this Dionysiac ecstasy in the wild is deliberately not the normal kind of behavior that happens in the city. So in the city, when you are sacrificing an animal, as you say, it's very different from what we see here. For a start, you sacrifice domestic animals. You don't sacrifice wild animals. And there's a little charade of innocence that you go through when you're sacrificing an animal if you're a Greek or a Roman. You sprinkle a bit of water on the animal's head so that it'll shiver and shake its head, and that says, oh, it's saying, yes, I want to be killed. So If you go out into the wild, on the other hand, and you just rip apart a wild animal, that's an utterly, utterly different kind of thing. So, in a sense, what's happening out in the wild, well, happening in inverted commas, because whether this actually really went on, heaven knows. I mean, both in drama and in art, it's entirely possible that this is just a way of exploring, as it were, rather than representing anything that happened. But anyway, what happens out in the wild is something which sets in contrast the way we do things in the city. Women don't come out. They don't leave the house, really. You know. And yet here they are, you know, up on the mountain without any men except satyrs. And how can you trust a woman around a satyr or a satyr around? You know, so everything is different. Everything is. Yeah.
Now that China's opening up, do they have much interest in the classics?
You know, every now and then we get an application from a Chinese graduate student who wants to come here to classics. There are some very scattered centers, but you could probably count on the fingers of two hands the number of people who are really qualified to teach Greek in China. There's an interesting history of Greek in China. The Jesuits went to China, you know, in the 1500s and translated Aristotle, for example, into Chinese, translated the Gospels into Chinese from Greek, also translated Aristotle into Chinese so that they could debate philosophy with Chinese philosophers. But no, it has no profile in China. Maybe it should. It would be nice. Sorry. Oh, perhaps you have information on that?
No, I'm not questioning. I kind of disagree with your assessment to the answer of the question.
Well, you were better placed.
I think that if you really analyze, like, say, connect to the question I just posed, you will find all the answers in teachings of Confucius.
Well, Confucius was.
It might sound like a very sweeping statement.
Yeah.
The Confucius, the Chinese teaching, as well as the Lao Tzu's teaching in Dao De Jing, it's always trying to tell you the objective world, it will constrain your freedom.
Yes. Yeah. It's not an easy message in America. Yes. Please.
I wanted to ask a question about the singing again. How much do we know about that? You had said that we knew that it was there by reason of the rhythm.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you did the little example, you read in rhythm, but I don't think you were really doing what we would call singing with pitches.
I can't sing. That was the main reason.
But I'm wondering, how much do we know about that? Was it singing with pitches as the way we think of singing in the opera?
The book on Greek music by Martin West, which is a great book, says we have to face the fact that we don't have direct evidence for music in the 5th century. There are actually, I think on rock, sorry, this is very much not my area, I can't sing, but I think there is a graffiti of a score of some kind.
At Delphi, there's like a staff and notes, I think.
That must be, thank you very much. I think that's what I'm dimly half remembering. So a certain amount is known about Greek music, but there is certainly no score for these plays. We really don't know what it sounded like. The one thing we do know is that it was regarded as qualitatively different from speech. I mean, you get a tiny example of this in Shakespeare, I suppose, even, don't you? Because there's the occasional song in Shakespeare. I don't know if there's any evidence about how they were meant to be sung, or if we know what they sounded like, or if there's a score for them. I have no idea. Anyway, but I'm afraid I'm quite ignorant about what it might really have sounded like.
If we wanted to reread the tragedies in translation, I'm afraid, are there annotated translations you would recommend?
I would recommend first the Chicago series by Lattimore, Lattimore, and they are they're not all by him by any means, but there's been an ongoing series. The Chicago series of translations by Lattimore is where I would start, and try to go to a production, because these, yes, yeah.
How did the Romans react to Greek tragedy?
By the time the Romans got around to Greek tragedy, the productive, creative phase of Greek tragedy had stopped, and so they were very much in the same position as us. These were established classics, but in fact, I'm writing a book at the moment about what happened on the 12th of September, 240 BC, when for the first time a translation from Greek into another language of a tragedy happened in Rome, translated by a Greek man into Latin. A tragedy of Euripides was put on at the Roman Games, at the Ludi Romani, and that was the beginning of what we now call Roman literature. So the Romans saw Greek tragedy and comedy too, and obviously we weren't talking about comedy, but saw them as the height of Greek culture, and if they were going to be an imperial power with cultural pretensions, they needed this, and so they translated it into Latin. Before then, there would have been Greek performances. I was in Emory, Atlanta, some years ago, and there was a exhibition of material from pre-Roman Carthage. There's not a lot of stuff from pre-Roman Carthage, because when the Romans destroyed Carthage, they obliterated the place entirely. But one of the objects on display was this little figurine like this. And I asked the curator, what's this? And he said, oh, it's a comic actor. It's terracotta, about that big. And this is one of various bits of evidence that show us that there were Greek companies touring the Mediterranean, visiting Carthage, visiting Rome, and putting on their plays, even if the local people's first language wasn't Greek, just as we go to an opera in Italian. You can't understand any of it, but I mean, so you go to a play in Greek. And so the Romans knew Greek tragedy, and so somehow sorry, I am a professor of Latin, somehow at a certain point, the Romans decided that they needed this in their own language. And why they did that is a very mysterious story, but they did. Sorry, we have... You're watching the time? You're watching the time?
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay. Please.
Your reference to touring Greek companies makes perfect sense to me, because the Greeks had colonized all around the Mediterranean, and of course in the 20th century we've seen the repatriation of Greeks from places like Asia Minor and so on. So have we looked for evidence of other evidence of Greek drama in some of these other locations?
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. Greek drama was, well, like high opera, in this way as well. And it was, a great cultural moment. And these touring companies, they were based on Delos, the island of Delos. Sorry, I've turned it off now, but anyway, in the middle of the Aegean. That was the headquarters. And South Italy, they were very popular. There were Greek cities, of course, dotted around South Italy, but even in the what the Greeks would have called the barbarian bits of South Italy, these plays were incredibly popular. There are lots of pots surviving. There are some in the Princeton Art Museum, Apulian vases, which show scenes from tragedy. So it was obviously very popular. And people were reading them. This is something that we shouldn't forget, too, that they were not only great cultural showpieces on the stage, they were also canonical texts, and people were reading them. There were commentaries written on them, and they were part of school education. If you were going to school as a Greek boy, I'm afraid Greek girls really didn't go to school, but if you're a Greek boy going to school by the age of 15 or 16, you start with Homer. Homer is the beginning of everything for the Greeks. But then you would certainly read some other tragedy. Euripides. Euripides was much the most popular of the three in later times. Much the most popular. People still read and staged Aeschylus and Sophocles, but Euripides was much, much more popular than those two. I think, okay.
Please join me in thanking Professor Feeney.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you.